Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lost Promise, American Universities in the 1960s by Ellen Schrecker, narrated by Janet Metzger. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you may hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. The trouble with this college, the trouble with every college in this country, is that we really are at the center. All the slogans about the colleges being the future of America, the poor bastards don't know how right they are. It was true. We were at the center of American consciousness. Our fantasies had finally caught up with us. Introduction: Universities in the Long 60s. Once upon a time, in the not-so-distant past, American higher education got a lot of respect. From the mid-1950s through to the early 1970s, colleges and universities were at the center of American life. Even as many campuses were racked by turmoil, they were also experiencing what has come to be seen as a golden age, at least for white men. Faculty positions were considered prestigious, and the academic community as a whole, faculty, students, both graduate and undergraduate, researchers, administrators, and intellectual hangers-on, seemed to be engaged in an exciting collective endeavor to improve their institutions and perhaps even make the world a better place. But it didn't last. The contradictions within the academic community ultimately brought that halcyon moment to a painful and confusing end, with consequences that haunt us to this day. By the mid-70s, colleges and universities no longer had the universal approval they once possessed. How and why that happened is the subject of this book. It is a chronicle of declension, a sobering story of how a seemingly indispensable social institution attained a position of power and approbation and then lost it. While today's colleges and universities, undermined by decades of disinvestment and disrespect, now struggle simply to survive, during the early 1960s, the Academy's influence extended far beyond its campuses. Especially after Sputnik, higher education emerged from the anti-intellectualism of the McCarthy era, where professors were scorned as eggheads, if not subversives, and students engaged in panty raids, not politics. Many in the academic community believed that they and their institutions were not only crucial to America's national security, but also central to economic progress. Showered with money by foundations and governments at every level, universities entered an era of unprecedented expansion. The period I'm calling the Long 60s was also when the Academy became the repository of the American dream, not only of upward mobility, but also, for many, of a more egalitarian society that would challenge the racial and gender intolerance and inequality that had for so long impeded human progress. As the quintessential liberal institution during the heyday of American liberalism, higher education attracted idealistic people, students and faculty alike, many of whom still trusted the authorities and their promises. Others, however, sought to shake up their campuses and disciplines. Gravitating into what was to become the New Left, radicals and left liberals wanted higher education to become a force for liberation available to all comers. Believing in the power of ideas, they felt that their intellectual efforts could influence the powers that be and move both the university and perhaps even the whole country toward justice and true democracy. That did not happen, of course. In retrospect, it's clear that the university never had as much power and autonomy as its members and critics assumed. Its enormous expansion and its accompanying optimism, as well as the pervasiveness of its own ivory tower myth, blinded the academic community, left, right, and center, to its own limitations. As institutions doubled and tripled in size, they were transformed, attracting the academically ambitious and often the unconventional, while putting a new emphasis on research instead of teaching. The ensuing cultural conflicts and turf battles, not to mention the growing political disagreements over Vietnam, race, and other divisive issues, made it impossible for the academic community to develop a coherent response to the challenges it faced from women, blacks, and its own radicals, as well as from conservative politicians and an increasingly hostile public. The situation was completely unprecedented. As in a recurring bad dream, the academic community was facing the final exam without having taken the course. Even today, American universities are still, by some measures, number one in the world. It is a ranking built on misconceptions, or perhaps the realization that higher education elsewhere also has its defects. Even before COVID-19, the academic community was suffering. With the traditional liberal arts in decline and underpaid and exploited part-time and temporary instructors supplying 75% of the teaching staff, only a handful of colleges and universities provided their graduates with much beyond technical training and considerable debt. But it didn't need to be that way. I admit to overstating my case. Still, it was hard to lose a dream and to do so suddenly. At some point around 1965, the bright promise of an expansive and liberating system of mass higher education darkened. The war in Southeast Asia and the failure of the political establishment to grant real equality to its citizens of color disabused and radicalized an entire generation of students and professors. Although most of the problems of racism, sexism, the Cold War, and economic inequality could not have been solved by educational reforms, left-wing critics deemed the university complicit in them. As a result, when some academic leaders could not or would not satisfy the radicals' mostly reasonable demands, their campuses seemed to spin out of control, destroying much of the public's previous confidence in higher education. The university was soon hollowed out and assaulted by the right-wing enemies of liberal culture, and it never recovered. There are two interrelated strands to this story: growth and turbulence. In the 60s, colleges and universities expanded so exponentially that their traditional folkways simply imploded. Many institutions would have been disrupted even if the rest of the United States had been calm, but it was not. Despite, or perhaps because of, the country's relative affluence, the struggle to fulfill the democratic promise of higher education in the face of racism, sexism, and U.S. warmongering ensured turbulence. It is impossible to stress enough how thoroughly the Vietnam War permeated the waking lives of student and faculty dissidents during the long 60s. It was distressing to find out from the newspapers every morning that our country had killed hundreds or perhaps thousands of men, women, and children the day before. Our shame, our anger, and ultimately our inability to stop the horror destroyed our trust in the liberal order. That disillusionment marked an entire generation. Whether it was biologists discovering that the U.S. Army was using their research to destroy crops in Southeast Asia, or professors refusing to flunk students who might then be drafted, the war ultimately forced faculty members of all political persuasions to face unwelcome but unavoidable moral choices. The university's long 60s occurred in several phases, beginning in the mid-1950s when the academic community emerged from its encounter with McCarthyism to enter a decade of optimism and expansion. By the middle of the 60s, events off campus, the Vietnam War, and struggle for racial equality in particular were to politicize higher education, even as its explosive growth was creating unforeseen tensions. For the next 5 to 10 years, confrontations took place at many, though by no means all, institutions. Finally, after one last burst of conflict, the unrest ended in the early 1970s as the war wound down, and the buoyant economic expansion of the previous decade sputtered to an end, inaugurating a new era of austerity. But because so much change occurred so quickly during those years, there is no coherent narrative, no single story that traces how one thing led to another. Everything seemed to be happening at once. Though petering out, the trauma endured. The events of the long 60s hung over higher education for the next half-century, while the backlash they incurred spilled over into the rest of society, poisoning its political discourse and paving the way for decades of neoliberal policies designed to shrink the public sector, its institutions of higher learning in particular. My protagonists are the men, women, and institutions of the academic community. Across the approximately 2,500 colleges and universities that flourished during the long 60s, that community comprised a congeries of students, professors, administrators, and ideologies sharing institutional connections, even if fragmented and all too often at odds. The key component was the faculty, the men. They were overwhelmingly men, who planned and taught the courses, did the research, and constructed academic careers. Undergraduates cycled through this world in 4-year cohorts of varying self-consciousness, while a smaller population of graduate students, as allies and intermediaries, bridged their world and that of the teachers. Many administrators were also faculty members who saw their service as temporary, even as their duties increasingly pulled them away from their original mindset and allegiances. Academia also housed public intellectuals and consultants, much of whose work life occurred off campus, clergy, including some of a radical bent, and such hangers-on as faculty wives, political activists, writers, and artists in residence. The book begins with a quick survey of the institutional expansion that began in the 1950s and the changes that accompanied it, particularly the uneven sloughing off of the political repression of the McCarthy era that had so completely marginalized the left. As seeds of political activity began to sprout, the Academy's newly energized radicals became involved with the vibrant civil rights movement of the early 1960s. Initiated by students at the black colleges and universities in the South, it offered the prospect of genuine social change. Soon, students demanding political freedom shook up Berkeley. As faculty members and administrators struggled to deal with the protests, political divisions emerged. Berkeley's experience presaged a pattern. Almost all of the subsequent waves of student unrest broke out first at major universities and big city campuses. Not only did those institutions attract politically engaged students and professors, but because of their size, they were able to produce a critical mass of activists that forced the academic community to respond and the media to pay attention. These large urban and elite institutions were where the action was, at least until the end of the 1960s: Berkeley, Michigan, Chicago, Wisconsin, CCNY, Columbia, Cornell, San Francisco State, and other major universities. Protests may have occurred later at lesser-known and smaller institutions, but the issues were the same as at the top-tier ones. Vietnam, of course. Radical and left-liberal professors and graduate students came to the issue first. The teach-ins they organized actually jump-started the anti-war movement. Although a minority at the time, their analyses of what was happening in Southeast Asia created the scenario about the conflict that most of their students and colleagues, as well as growing numbers of political leaders and ordinary Americans, were eventually to embrace. Later on, as both student and faculty radicals raised new questions about their institution's collaboration with the national security state, the protests intensified. Frustrated by their failure to end the war, some increasingly desperate activists even turned to civil disobedience. Today, after all the years of rhetoric about tenured radicals and Marxist professors, it might be a surprise to learn that the overwhelming majority of faculty members in the long 60s, even the liberal ones, opposed the student disruptions. Most academics were essentially apolitical, moderates who wanted nothing more than for everything to calm down. They definitely did not appreciate having to make what the political theorist Michael Walzer called the harsh choices the 1960s forced upon them. Unfortunately, however, the university was confronting such polarizing issues that its members could not avoid taking sides, forming factions that split the community. Confusion reigned. Neither faculties nor administrations seemed able to offer coherent responses to their troubles, an unfortunate situation that could only encourage hostile outsiders to intervene. Radical academics did not dominate the nation's faculties, but they did have an impact. They created their own organizations, appealed to audiences on and off the campus, and in many cases worked with local and national left-wing peace and social justice groups. Though often marginalized and even repressed, they did bring new perspectives and somewhat more democratic practices into the university. That almost all of them were men certainly deserves mention. Although second-wave feminism got much of its early energy from within the academic community, it did not come into its own until the long 60s was about to end. As political activism tapered off in the early 1970s, a financial crunch hit the academic community, forcing even the wealthiest Ivy League institutions to dip into their endowments for operating expenses and admit women to keep their enrollments up. The fiscal plight of public institutions was even more alarming. Increasingly upset by the student unrest, the politicians who had so generously supported state colleges and universities reversed course. By the late 1960s, although enrollments continued to grow, the democratic vision of universal mass higher education evaporated. Within a few years, as tuitions rose rapidly and ballooning debt began to subvert the life chances of students, tenure-track jobs melted away, transforming most prospective faculty members into permanent temp workers without either economic security or academic freedom. Obviously, the university's turmoil during the long 60s did not cause all these problems directly. Nonetheless, the inability of the academic community to meet the reasonable demands of its constituents for a more democratic campus meant that its members lacked the solidarity that an effective defense against the conservative onslaught required. If nothing else, the academic community's past problems should alert its current members to the urgent need for unity in the face of existential challenges. This is a big book. It could have been 3 times as long. I had to force myself to keep it within limits, and did so by eliminating dozens of fascinating case studies. Every chapter, sometimes every paragraph, deals with subjects that deserve entire volumes of their own, some of which have already been written. I do not, for example, pay much attention to the development and activities of the student movement, since many others have done so. Nor do I give as much consideration as they deserve to events toward the end of the long 60s, like the early women's movement, the Academy's structural reforms and pedagogical experiments, and the details of the backlash. The book consists of 4 sections. The first deals with the massive expansion of higher education, as well as the nascent political activities of academics during the early part of the long 60s. The second covers the growth of the anti-war movement and the development of opposition to war-related research. The third looks at the student unrest, as well as at the ways in which faculties and administrators struggled to handle it. The final section deals with the radical academics, tracing their political work as well as their scholarship and, of course, the opposition they encountered. My biggest challenge has been shaping all this into a coherent whole. It was not only an intellectual challenge, but a political one. I found my opinions about the events I had lived through complicated by having to rethink, if not necessarily revise, my original assessments. It's my fervent hope that, in light of the current threats to the university, and perhaps even to the American democratic system as a whole, I will not be alone in looking again at the long 60s and figuring out what lessons it can teach us. Chapter 1. Good Times for Scholars. The Golden Age of American Higher Education. When E. Alden Dunham, Princeton's former director of admissions, visited the State University of New York at Brockport on a fact-finding mission for the Carnegie Commission on Higher Education in the late 1960s, he was both awed and horrified. Muddy, barren, and cluttered with cranes, the school seemed to be one huge construction site, an instant campus that Dunham considered architecturally unimpressive, largely because the buildings look alike and are crowded together. Of course, aesthetics was hardly at issue for Brockport's ambitious leaders, as they struggled to accommodate their school's exploding student body and growing faculty. Founded in 1835 by a group of Baptists as the Brockport Collegiate Institute to offer what amounted to a high school education with some teacher training on the side, it became the Brockport State Normal School in 1867, and then, in the early 1940s, the Brockport State Teachers College, with a campus consisting of one building, a few hundred students, and less than 50 professors and administrators. After joining the State University of New York, SUNY, in 1948, Brockport really began to grow. By the mid-1960s, it had become the State University College of Arts and Sciences at Brockport, with 2,500 students and 200 faculty and staff members. By the end of the decade, it was up to 5,500 students and 350 faculty members. The physical campus expanded as well, adding residence halls, a college union, library, and all the other buildings that Dunham had found so unappealing. The school's mission had also changed. SUNY Brockport was now the largest public institution of higher education in the Rochester area, offering both undergraduate and master's degree programs in education and the liberal arts. An expanding sector. Dunham saw the same transformation at most of the 14 other middle-level state institutions of higher learning he visited. From Chico State in California, to Western Michigan University, to Ball State in Indiana, to Missouri Southern State University, construction was booming, educational offerings were proliferating, and the schools were expanding in every way. Had he gone to Tampa, he would have seen the brand-new University of South Florida springing up on the site of a World War II bombing range. A similar sight would have greeted him in Bellingham, Washington, where a teacher's college was turning into the 4-year Western Washington University. Everywhere the same transformation: new residence halls, libraries, student centers, and ever larger parking lots. Public higher education expanded most extensively. As late as 1950, state colleges and universities accounted for less than 50% of the nation's college students. 20 years later, they were educating 75% of them. This growth was most dramatic at the second-tier state schools like SUNY Brockport. The already large urban campuses like San Francisco State and the City College of New York, CCNY, were also growing and running out of space. At City College, one faculty member recalled, "The school now resembled a subway rush hour that lasted from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. Facilities had to be upgraded as well. Similar transformations were taking place at flagship state universities like Berkeley and Wisconsin, and even at private schools. Stanford's enrollment surged from 3,000 students in 1945 to 11,500 25 years later, as the school morphed from a somewhat provincial home for well-heeled California playboys into a national academic powerhouse. Though we tend to associate the 60s on campus with student protest, with images of Mario Savio atop a police car in the middle of the Berkeley campus, or the gun-toting members of Cornell's African American Association exiting the Student Center after a day and a half of occupation, a more authentic portrayal might well show countless building cranes. For we simply cannot understand what happened to the academic community during the 1960s and early 1970s unless we realize that it was growing exponentially. Numbers tell the story. Between 1959 and 1969, enrollments in higher education went from more than 3.6 million students to roughly 8 million, while the number of institutions also increased from 2,004 to 2,525 during the 1960s and to 3,152 by 1979, and the size of those schools tripled. California's grew first, fastest, and largest. The state's famous Master Plan for Higher Education of 1960 specified that its institutions would expand by 350% between 1958 and 1975. Before World War II, its state college system consisted of 7 schools with 13,000 students. By the late 1960s, it comprised 20 institutions and 170,000 students, with more than 200,000 in 1970. The University of California system expanded as well, from 7 campuses with 43,600 students in 1948 to 8 with over 100,000 and growing in 1965. And its community colleges also grew massively. The younger SUNY system grew from 34,000 students in 1960 to 117,000 in 1970, with some 28 separate units. In New York City, the CUNY system debuted in 1962 with nearly 100,000 students and increased to 160,000 by 1975. Individual schools grew as well, if they hadn't started from scratch. In the year that CCNY's open admissions program began, its freshman class rose from 1,752 to 2,742. UCLA, which already had 10,000 students before World War II, doubled by the end of the 1950s. San Francisco State, established in 1956, had 18,000 students by the end of the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?